There's another excellent podcast that I think you may actually only be able to find it on YouTube now, because I think they've taken it off of iTunes. But it's called This Cultural Moment by John Mark Comer and Mark Sayers. And this was done in 2018. Some of it is probably moved on. I will say that their predictions are pretty frighteningly accurate. Mm-hmm. And so, like, they talk about how cultures kind of had this progression where you have a post-Christian or a pre-Christian culture, which would be a paganistic kind of culture that's there, and then you have a Christianized culture, which, to define that's not necessarily like it's a Christian society, but it has been influenced by Christian morals. Victorian England wouldn't necessarily go so far as to say it's a Christian society, because it still did a lot of things that are questionable. Yeah. But the morals were definitely being informed by Christianity at the time. Okay. Get into how, I guess, later on where you're seeing the British Empire break apart, like things with like India, where it's getting its independence through Mahatma Gandhi. There's actually a quote at Mahatma Gandhi's tomb that's written by, I believe, Bertrand Russell, who was an atheist. And his comment was, the quote at the tomb says, "It is doubtful that the Mahatma's methods would have been successful had they not been appealing to the conscience of a Christianized nation." And so there's something in there where it's like the non-violence worked because the Christians were like, that's not to say they didn't do atrocious things, but they started to balk at violent retaliation against these non-violent
it caused
demonstrations.
You would say,
yeah, and so they started going, oh well, like there's just something not right about this, and so eventually it's like that. So you have this Christianized nation, but then you have a post-Christian society, which is, they'll define that as they want the kingdom without a king. They want all of this heaven stuff, all of this, this Sermon on the Mount, how everything's made right, everything's made just, and all of these sort of things that the Bible describes, but they don't want the authority involved in it.
You know what this kind of reminds me of a little bit? This reminds me of, I forgot the name of the passage, but I think it's in either 1st or 2nd Samuel, when it's talking about how Israel is becoming more of like a nation and a kingdom, and then the people are like, we want a king. Yeah. And God's like, okay, fine, I'll give you a king to be like the rest of the nations. And it's almost like we have a reversal of that somewhat now, where it's like... Well,
it still exists. It's just the difference is even with that, when they were asking for a king, they were rejecting
him,
God.
Yeah.
They wanted to be like everybody else. They didn't want to be ruled by God. They wanted to have it their own way. Mm-hmm. And that's that disconnect. And so you have this post-Christian society is they want to do all these good things, but the fun part is if you ask, okay, what makes this good?
Goes back to God.
Suddenly our feet are planted in midair. I can explain chapter and verse why racism is bad. But if you go to Darwinism...
Yeah, there's no real...
Where... Yeah. How did you come to your conclusion of right and wrong? Because Darwin was like, well... might makes right. That's a Darwinian, and that's the other thing with that is something like naturalism doesn't have a right or wrong, because lions aren't evil because they eat gazelle. They're hungry.
Can you elaborate just on the naturalistic worldview, if just because maybe some of our viewers might not know exactly what that is?
So naturalism true naturalism at least, something that Darwin himself would, well, I wouldn't even say that Darwin ascribed to it, because Darwin makes a creationist argument in The Origin of Species. But so it is this, the natural world is just that. It is, nature takes its course. That's why, when you see a naturalist or a biologist or a zoologist out there studying something on, the Serengeti, their main goal is they don't want to interfere because that's nature's course. Mm-hmm. And that's how, and they're review, that's the idea even with evolution, is that's just the natural course of how things gone. Things grow, they adapt, and they either adapt or they become extinct.
So you'd say the naturalistic worldview is more of just whatever happens.
It's meant to be, the science in and of itself is meant to be, or attempts to be, objective. It's not meant to have a moral standing in a lot of cases.
Okay.
And that's kind of their, when you read research on, or you read literature on research, like they'll make that case as science is meant to be more of a tool to explore certain natural phenomenon. It's not meant to be making a moral call left or right.
I've always thought about this analogy as in like, in order to know how to use a pencil, you probably want to like go to the person who created the pencil, which is just, you use the pencil to write. But if you just try to use it for other things, like kill somebody or something heinous,
going full John Wick over there.
Well,
I'm just
saying. I think for me personally, that's a helpful analogy to understand that.
Yeah.
There's a designer.
Naturalism
purpose.
Naturalism and science in and of themselves do not make moral claims. They are a process by which to explore the natural world.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the thing, like, from a truly naturalistic point of view, again, lions aren't evil because they eat gazelle. They're hungry. They have to eat.
Yeah.
Hurricanes aren't evil. They just
happen.
are. They are natural phenomenon that just happen. And so, when humans start trying, when you get out of that vein, now we're out of,
We're going to the realm of ethics.
Yes.
Stuff
like ethics is the realm of philosophy and religion.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's not, or civics or something along those lines. Science in and of itself is meant to be objective. That's
Speaking
the
of
whole point.
philosophy, though, that it kind of reminded me of existentialism a little bit, like Kierkegaard and people like that,
Yeah.
where they their big thing was, basically because there is no meaning, I'll create my own, in a sense. I would like you to discuss, I guess, what's the major problems with that, if you see any, and then also, in a way, maybe even steelman that side, and then also look at the aspect of the religious side, the pros, but also maybe the cons.
So, like when you get into that level of existentialism, the idea of like creating meaning, one, I'm going to fall in the camp that I don't necessarily disagree with all of that. Again, like part of what I like about that, I'll put that out there, is this way, is humans can get into this rhythm of, we're subject to X. We don't have any
Decision making.
Yeah, we don't have any authority. Don't have any. It's already predetermined, predestined, all this sort of stuff. Which all
that'd be the determinism aspect.
Yes, and that argument, for me at least, theologically, when I dug around in it, that doesn't make sense. Again, this goes into.
It starts getting into some heavy.
Yeah, like.
Yeah.
I'm a myth nerd. I love to go through and look at myths and legends and paganism and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And a common thread in a lot of paganistic deals. The Greeks and the Norse probably being the biggest two culprits. The idea of fate,
Mm-hmm.
even in both of those mythologies, the highest gods are still subject to the fates. I mean, the Norns in Norse mythology, and the outright what we translate as the fates in Greek.
Mm-hmm.
Zeus isn't technically omnipotent because he's still subject to fate. He's immortal. They can't cut the string and kill him, which is what the fates did to mortals. They would, they measure out your lifespan and then cut it, and that's the whole symbolism thing. The Norns were the same way. But they were still subject to the fate.
How things will end up being. There's no way of getting out of it.
And that's not, for me, when I look at one, if God's omnipotent, he cannot be subject to fate.
He's outside of it.
Yes. He, anything that's going to happen in the future, the stuff that we talk about of his return and things like this, that's based on his omnipotence.
Okay.
It's going to happen because he said it's going to happen. And by the way, I have the power to make it happen. By the way, I also have the Bible scripturally doesn't back that, it doesn't back the idea of fate up. God changes his mind in Scripture.
That's true.
Abraham talks him down.
Well, what do you say, though, about the other areas to where, you have, for example, in the Greek, I know ordained or preordained is mentioned at least, I think, 2 to 3 times. So, would you say it's more on the free will, or would you say it's probably a mixture of both? Maybe something we just might not understand.
I would say that it probably breaks down in certain areas, but I believe
on both sides, or just
in that where you start to break it down with someone, well, I'm called to do this. Well, yeah, I would believe that God has sown desires into each human heart. Yeah. Desire is not inherently evil. Desire was put into us to go do things.
So you'd say that's a little touch of God right there.
Yeah, there was how it interacts with a broken world, because that's how sin works. I'm actually going to steal this from Pastor Sampson. I'm citing my sources, but when you talk about,
he's a wise man.
So sin is kind of a complex topic where on this one level it is very much the ring from Lord of the Rings is how I love to put it. It is this malevolent, sentient force that has its own will and desire, and it's parasitic in nature. It lives off of us. That is, and that's very much this idea of little g gods and paganism, that there is this crossover that happens. But on another level, it's also like gravity. Everything in creation is subject to the law of gravity in some shape, form, or fashion. Well, everything in creation is subject to the law of sin. It has all been impacted in a particular way by sin. And so those desires, though, they were created and intended and sown into us for good purposes. Being in a broken world, things get twisted. It gets reshaped. It gets impacted by that. And but at the end of the day, we still have this desire, and we still have the ability to determine how we're going to let it manifest. We have the responsibility for how it's going to manifest. We are co-create. If we're made in the image of God, part of God's image, is, part of God's nature is He's a creator. And so if we bear that image, then part of what we're called to do is create. We're meant to go and
that's you'd say that's the choice that does align with Christianity in the existentialist view.
The idea of going out and creating meaning, uncovering, being proactive in uncovering, exploring, and, finding the meaning. In some cases, the meaning that God sowed there from the beginning, perhaps, there's a lot of story overlap with that. A character's going to find meaning through going through the process of the story. But if somebody's exploring, they're finding meaning because they're exploring, and they're finding things that were already put there for them to find, perhaps.
Yeah.
And so that aspect of it, I think that, Kierkegaard and guys like Frankl, they're going to be more pluralist with it, but I don't necessarily think that it disagrees a lot with Christianity, if that makes sense.
No, with the whole choice and how God is in line with that choice and stuff. I could see that. So I guess you would say then, so what would you say is probably the biggest downfall, if you had to say, with the religious, and this isn't just Christianity, I don't want to say this is just Christianity, but just the religious idea of taking your morals from a God or a book or a holy scripture, in a sense?
What do you mean?
So we discussed with existentialism and the choice. We kind of already went into the pros and cons of that, but also how Christianity flows into that.
Yeah.
I kind of want to go on the other side of the spectrum to where it's it's not just Christianity, but just in religions in general that take from a certain God. What would you say is the pros and cons of that? So we would probably agree that the pros is that they have foundation to stand on with
Yeah,
their morals.
and so it's always the thing with all of us. I mean, Christianity is even subject to this. Okay, if you talk to somebody that's building a skyscraper,
Yeah.
okay, 100-story skyscraper,
Mm-hmm.
the part that they are going to obsess the most about is the foundation. They're going to like have the rulers out down to, the smallest measurement they can to make sure it's as precise as is humanly possible. Because if they're off an inch at the bottom, it's compounding. They're off 10 feet at the top.
So ripple effects.
Yeah, if my assumption of reality at the bottom is off, even just a little, when I start to build on it, I run the risk of it falling over. And that's where you get into, philosophy-wise, you get into stuff like Pascal's wager.
Can you elaborate on that? Like
So
what exactly
Pascal's
is
wager, technically it's even based off of, his wager's based off of Paul, where Paul's like, if we're wrong, we are to be pitied among all people, because we are sacrificing a lot.
Oh, doesn't that kind of go with Nietzsche when he said God is dead, but then right after that he said we're going into chaos?
Nietzsche, the thing with God is dead is he then goes around and goes, but then how are we?
This is bad.
Which way's
this
up?
Is not good. Yeah.
Who gave us permission to blot out the horizon? We're going to have to invent new myths in order to keep society on its head. It's not every day that I agree with Nietzsche.
Same here.
But of course, I don't think
he has some good points.
I don't think he would be offended because he'd also be like, I don't agree with you either because you're a Christian. Just out of principle, he's not going to agree with anything I say. That's the risk. And if you're off a little, you're off an inch at the bottom, you're off 10 feet at the top. You're like, we run this risk. And Pascal's wager was, he throws it out there. Is it better to go and live however you want to live because you don't believe there is a God, but then you run the risk that if there is a God and you just broke all the rules, if you you live life as he said is going to end in a particularly unpleasant fashion, that's a big risk. Whereas is it better to, abide by these, these laws or these commandments, these desires that God has for us? Is it better to live by those? In which case, you may miss out on some of the pleasures that this world offers, quotes around that. But then you get the reward of being, an eternal bliss.
Yeah.
Which is a better, which is his own, I can poke at that in some ways, but like, that's the thing that's being offered. And so, even with,
is it worth it? Is that what you're saying?
It's
is
like,
it worth it?
Is
it worth the grind? So it's almost like I'm training forever and a day to go to the NBA or go to the UFC or do something great, and I do all this work, and then I never even get in.
Yeah, well, and it's even this argument, it's not even, Christianity at its roots, it is not about following the rules. At its root, it's not even about heaven.
It's about just being with God.
It's about relation with Jesus, with God.
Yeah.
That's the whole, what makes heaven so special.
Yeah, I always tell people if you want to go to heaven, just go to heaven. There's probably a problem with that.
Yeah,
there's a huge problem with that.
You
shouldn't want to go to heaven. You should just want to be with Jesus.
Yeah, even the whole thing with there's no more pain and he'll wipe every tear from our eyes. The people are like, well, there's not going to be any crying in heaven. Yeah. It says he'll wipe every tear from your eyes. That implies that there's going to be some tears.
That reminds me of a movie. I think it's called No Country for Old Men.
Yes.
Where the
incredibly violent movie for the record, but yes.
Yes, but he said, there's like a really, really good, I think he said, if the rule brought you to this point, what good was the rule? And I kind of see that applying to this as in like with not Christianity, but the religious aspect of it. You follow these rules, but at the end of the day, these rules never fixed your heart. Never fixed your mind. Yeah,
and that's at the end of the day, Christianity's built to be a relationship. It's built to operate off the principles of love and being in a relationship. And so those rules, they're not meant to be legalistic. My beautiful bride is here with me. And so there are things, I what's some? I'm trying to think. I had a good one earlier of like there are some things that I naturally. Oh, okay. I will say unkind things about other drivers as I drive, and I will be pretty mean. And my sweet bride is one of the sweetest people on the planet, and this hurts her heart when I say these things, okay? But now it's a natural reaction for me, whether it's nature or nurture that has established it. It is a secondhand thing. You cut me off, I'm probably going to say something in British slang about you, and it's not nice,
Okay.
right? Or I may say something, I may say or do something that hurts her.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I keep blatantly doing that, what's going to happen to my marriage?
Won't go too well.
Because I've communicated that her wants and needs don't matter. I don't love you. Now, if I love you, that
You'll
hurt you,
change.
and I don't
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah.
I don't want to hurt you. I want to love you. And so in that case, I'm going to try to honor what you need and what you ask of me. Gentlemen, if she says to put the toilet seat down, for the love of God, put the toilet seat down. Right? Like, it's not that hard. I'm to be considerate of that. Now, the problem is, like I said, I have a habit where there's a justifiable excuse or not. And so I am going to slip up. It's going to happen. You're going to cut me off, and I'm going to call you a bellend. And,
But it's the act of trying, though.
well,
Or it's the heart of
and
wanting
so
to try.
that slips out. So now what do I have to do? I need to go, I'm sorry. I have to practice repentance.
Mm-hmm.
I have to, for a human, they have to practice giving grace, which is a little harder. But God, that is his nature, is to have grace for us, to have mercy for us. So, the tension then is to accept that grace and to continue moving forward and to build on that, if that makes any sense. And so that is the process of redemption.
Would you say that's also, in a way, of also how the structure of Christianity is expelled within or demonstrated within a marriage as well?
Yeah. And so, that's the whole thing, is we're in this relationship. That's how all of this works. And that's the whole process of Christianity, is this redemptive process.
Mm-hmm.
Again, heaven is not at the end of this. Christianity is not about, fire insurance. The goal, I'll poke at churches for this, the goal is not baptism. Baptism is not the end goal. Baptism is the starting line. The process is meant to begin this process of going back to Eden, to going back to how we were created to be in the beginning, this redemptive process.
To be in fellowship with God.
Well, yeah, to be being made whole again. And that is the goal of Christianity. It is a practice of eternity. I think it's Bob Goff who talks about, like, living down here is not about trying to be perfect, and it's not trying, necessarily to even get to heaven. The idea is we're practicing for eternity if we're Christians.
Mm-hmm.
We're supposed to live for forever. That is the belief of Christianity. There's this transition point that happens, sure, but, the way we are down here is we're practicing for the rest of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the end goal of Christianity, is this idea of, we're in fellowship with God. We're becoming more and more who he created us to be in the beginning. Those desires are coming to fruition, and they're being redeemed in the process of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the roots of it all, is about this redeeming process.